I hope you all had a great reading week, and I hope your midterms are going well. Apologies for this being a recorded lecture. Obviously, schedules didn't really work out to be doing this live as regular, but I'm hoping this also gives you all the opportunity to finish your midterms and do the best work you possibly can and start thinking ahead for your capstone part 2 projects. For today, this is going to be a recorded lecture, as obviously. We're looking at brand architecture, which is kind of the start of our second half of the semester. So whereas in the first half of the semester, we were looking at brand marketing through the context of psychology and communication, and then ultimately relationships, facing forward, we're going to start looking at how brand marketing works from a practical and professional perspective, really trying to dive into some of the more applied context of the way in which brands market and some of the applications of that psychology and communications. And one of the first ways in which we're going to do that, and what we're going to talk about and sort of begin with this week, is the idea that brands are constructed or built or developed in such a way as to communicate something, and that core and central element of brand management and the way in which we communicate through marketing and the way in which we develop out organizations and brands and identities and meaning is through the architecture of these organizations, thinking about the structures and relationships that exist between different entities. So for the course of this lecture and for the next few lectures, the emphasis is really going to be on thinking about how we communicate through brands and how brands communicate something about themselves through the ways in which they build themselves. So we're going to start with a couple of quick announcements, and then I'm going to speak quickly to capstone part 2. So one of the advantages of doing this as a recorded lecture is that I can share the next step of your capstone projects and give you some of the background needed to be able to complete and conduct your brand marketing audits. Then from there, I'm going to speak to a bit more about the brand management and strategy side of architecture, the reasoning behind brand architecture, what it looks like, and what the significance is from a brand marketing perspective. And then we'll dive a bit deeper into the actual portfolios and relationships. Now, as a reminder for the brand architecture side and for everything that we're going to be talking about here, there is a reading online. There are a couple of readings that will help this week and next week really flesh out some of these ideas and really give you a bit of an idea what to expect. And also, as a reminder, beginning next week, we will start to have our case studies. So for the second half of the semester, there will be 3 case studies, each worth 10% of your final grade. The first one will be released next week. So understanding brand marketing and brand management from this perspective and from next week's context will start to help out a lot. If you have any questions at all about this week's lecture, if you have anything you want to chat about, obviously hit me up, send me email, connect with me during office hours as soon as you can. But hopefully this all makes sense. We're ready to go, and we'll start. A couple of announcements. And the first is the midterm. For those of you who are watching this week after reading week or in our usual Wednesday time slot, the midterm is due Friday, October 22nd at 5 p.m. For those of you who are possibly watching this later, you can skip ahead. But for the midterm itself, if you haven't already, please read and review the instructions again. Before you submit this, before you complete it, before you're ready to go, make sure that you have completed each of the tasks and every element of the midterm to the fullest extent possible. Look at how you're being graded. Make sure that you are completing those elements. Secondly, read the questions again. Make sure that you understand exactly what's being asked of you and are answering everything that needs to be there and using the resources necessary to do that. Lastly, be mindful of length. So the hope and the intent here with the page limit and the maximum pages is to force you to be as clear and concise in your answers as possible. We're not looking for any extra words. We're not looking for you to fill those pages. We're looking for you to answer the questions to the best and fullest extent possible without waffling, without adding any sort of feathery or flowery language that doesn't need to be there. So make sure before you submit this at 5 p.m. on Friday that you've read and understood exactly what's expected of you, that you've answered everything to the best of your ability in that context, and that you're doing so in the best way that you can. If you have all that set up, if you're ready to go, fantastic, wonderful, you've got this. If you're watching this after the 22nd, no worries, on to the next one. And the next one is the next step of your capstone project. So everyone will have submitted capstone part 1 and will have received some feedback on your ideas and your topics already. The next element of your projects then is to conduct a marketing audit or brand audit of an organization or a campaign that explicitly exemplifies or applies or illustrates the marketing concept that you are going to be looking at. So for example, if you want to look at humor in marketing, your example might be all the really kind of zany and off the wall advertisements that Old Spice produced. So you would do a brand audit of Old Spice and look at how Old Spice has gone about creating and conducting their marketing. This second part of the project is due November 10th at 5 p.m. One per group, obviously, on Sakai. It's worth 20% of your grade, and it should be something between 10 and 15 pages of length. But this is a rough estimate. There's no hard and fast rules. There's no minimum or maximum length. It's really what it takes to be able to do this. As ever, APA formatted, yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to take away marks for not having a running head or for having a title page that's a little bit off. But what I am looking for is a thorough and intelligent and articulate explanation of how your concept works in practice. Now, part of the advantage of this part of the project is that it will allow you to start to see and look at examples of the topic that you're going to be exploring for your final project, for your video essay. And the hope is that by being able to see these illustrations and understand and break down and think about what makes these illustrations work using that concept, you'll be able to articulate that better and explain that better in your video essays. As far as what a marketing audit is, there's some information obviously online with the assignment, but what you're essentially going to be trying to do is a reverse of your SPMA 2P65 marketing plan. So rather than setting out a strategy of what we're going to do, the intent of a brand audit or a marketing audit is to essentially evaluate what has been done. So you're going to essentially try to assess or analyze the success or failure of a brand in utilizing the topic or the concept that you're going to be exploring for your project. What you'll do is you will, through a very structured and quite formal report, identify the objectives of the brand and the specific campaign or campaigns that they've used to try to achieve those objectives. You're going to speak to the target markets that you feel that they identified. You're going to try to find as much information as you can about how much it cost or what they spent on it or the processes and procedures and costs that went into creating that campaign, and then evaluate ultimately how successful they were in achieving their objectives. Now, the important thing here is really aligning and linking the objectives with the target market or audiences and the ultimate returns and your evaluation of whether or not they were successful in doing this. The actual costs, things like that, if you can't find that information, it's not that big of a deal. But what you really should be able to do and what you need to be able to assess is understanding what the objectives are or were for that brand. What were they trying to accomplish in utilizing this concept and in creating this campaign, and were they successful in doing so? Now, to do this as a basic structure, as kind of an overall idea, you'll have your normal title page, an intro, which will essentially explain the context and the topic you're looking at, identify who the brand is, identify the campaign, explain why you think that campaign or that brand utilizes your concept in some way. Go through a quick organizational analysis, so explain who the brand is and what they do. Then very explicitly talk to the campaign. And here you can use examples. You're welcome to use screenshots or images or pictures or data, whatever you can find that helps explain this campaign. So what was it that they were doing and how did they do it? And then critically analyze that. So think about what worked about that, what didn't. How did they apply the concept? What is it that they did that helped them achieve their objectives or didn't? And then end with some quick recommendations and a conclusion. So if you felt like Old Spice's ads weren't actually all that creative or funny, and instead of using humor, they were actually making dad jokes and really alienating a younger audience, say that. If you feel like it really regenerated the brand and gave Old Spice a completely different perspective for the audience, then speak to how that worked and what they could do next. End with some references and some appendices, and you're all set and ready to go. If you have any questions about all this, if you need any help, do not hesitate to reach out, ask questions, make sure that you connect with me as soon as possible so that I can help you with this. But fundamentally, this should be a fairly straightforward illustration and example of the concept and topic that you're looking at. And if you can wrap your heads around that and make this work for you, this will benefit you and help you for your final video essay. And it will also give you a better understanding of how we actually elaborate upon and think about the success of marketing. If you have any questions, as I say, let me know. Otherwise, we'll jump into the next step and get into the lecture. Brand architecture. As a idea and as a concept for marketing, especially at this level, it's possibly a little bit arbitrary or a little bit complex in terms of the applications that we might see from an industrial perspective. And in fact, brand architect is actually a industry term. It is a job, it is a role, especially in Europe, where that is a sort of fixed and known idea. But for our perspective, and really typically more North American context, brand architecture actually refers to much more of an organizational perspective and context, wherein we look at and think about the relationships that exist between different elements of a brand. And in this respect and in this way, we're talking about brands as being much more encompassing. So rather than thinking about, let's say, Nike as a singular brand, Nike in fact makes up many different elements of their own brand. And so the way in which we contextualize and think about brand architecture is thinking about the relationships that exist, for example, between Nike as a parent brand and, let's say, the Air Jordan line. So the ways in which different elements of the same brand, in this case, the core Nike brand and Air Jordan, fit possibly with different markets or aim to have different products or ultimately benefit or contribute in some different ways to the way in which the organization works. Now, what this really is rooted in and what this really speaks to is the idea of brand identity, which is central to the way in which brands begin to construct their own associations and try to really formalize and understand and communicate who and what they are and what they represent to their external audiences. Capfer here refers to the brand's tangible and intangible characteristics. So basically everything that can make up a brand and be communicated outwardly forms that brand's identity. So whether we're talking about the people who work there, or we're talking about the places that they build or where they work, or we're talking about the products they create or their logos and images and colors, everything ultimately becomes their brand's identity and is the way in which they communicate outwardly to audiences to try to say something about what they are. This is how we utilize all of those stimuli and those texts and subtexts from the first half of the semester to try to create associations and build out something of meaning in people's minds. Now, the inverse of this and the flip of this is that brand identity actually becomes from a perceptual perspective or a subjective perspective from the audience's side as brand image. So where brand identity is what the organization tries to communicate, brand image is essentially what the audience or what a consumer receives. So our perception of what's being communicated to us. And this is an important construct, and this is an important sort of dichotomy that exists in marketing, and will relate back to explicitly the idea of architecture here, is that when we think about brands as consumers, we are processing what is being shared with us by the brand and thinking about all the information that is being constructed by the brand, and then allocating that information and understanding that information in a very specific and subjective way. What brands are trying to aspire to and what they're trying to communicate and create themselves, their identity, does not always fit with their image. And this is fundamentally because brands are social constructs, which means that while they exist from an organizational and corporate perspective in a very controlled environment and are something that are manicured and are manipulated and are grown really quite strategically in a lot of cases by brands, the reality is that our perceptions of them, our experiences with them, our views and impressions and understandings of brands come from a very subjective place. And therefore, the identities and the images of brands are very much built and framed around how we experience them. And that's really important because from a brand's perspective, as we start to think about the larger brand in terms of what they own and what they operate and what they connect with, we have to understand different elements of that brand and how they link back to and relate back to fundamentally feeding into the image that we have of the core brand. Now, to give you an idea and an understanding of what an identity looks like for brands, the brand identity prism has been put forward in marketing literature and in marketing research as a way to kind of formalize and construct how we think about identity or image and how brands can go about creating that. And these range from in a prism perspective or a prismatic perspective, the physique of a brand, which refers to kind of the more physiological or physical aspects, so a logo, symbols, trademarked phrases and terms, things like that, all the way over to the culture in which they relate. And the prism itself kind of refers to both the picture that the sender tries to release or give out to the world, so the way in which they try to communicate that physique or utilize those images and those constructs as a way to brand themselves, or the personality that they are trying to convey. So in the case of Nike here, being really quite athletic, being countercultural, being cool, being part of the cultural zeitgeist. Or the picture from the receiver, so the way in which the brand relates back to the individual. So how we reflect upon our experiences with that brand, or how we reflect upon ourselves. So do people wear Nike because they themselves see themselves as athletes, or because they see themselves as cool? If you're talking, let's say, about Adidas, do people wear Adidas Stan Smiths because they are an element of cool? Are they part of the culture as a street shoe that people can identify with as just being kind of cool? Or are they wearing them because they're playing tennis in the 1950s? There is a link here between what we see and what we're being sent. In the same way, there is both the internalization and the externalization of brands. So the way in which we view things outwardly or experience things outwardly versus the way in which we view them internally. So thinking about the brand in this context, in the prism that is constructed here, is something that both a brand marketer is able to construct and elaborate upon, but it's also something that we as consumers can experience and see. We know and experience the Nike brand through its logo, through things like the Just Do It tagline. But equally, when we think about a brand like Nike, there is an element of culture. There is an element of self-respective image or reflection. The way in which we construct these brands comes to or speaks to how we understand them. From an architectural perspective, what this essentially then becomes is how we understand these different elements of a brand prism or the identity prism as they relate to different parts and parcels of those internal and external elements, or those sender or receiver elements. From an architectural perspective, we can also talk to, and we also very specifically are referring to then, how the organizations are structured. And it's important here to think about brands in a really kind of capital B, big brand context. Most brands, from an organizational perspective or a corporate perspective, actually house or incorporate multiple sub-brands or different elements of that brand, different entities within an organization that require some level of management that speaks to the overall corporate brand or the major brand. By thinking about how those brands interrelate, by thinking about what messages they send or what messages are being received within those brands, we're able to organize and begin to structure the relationships of a portfolio of different sub-entities or brands within the brands to be able to maximize the overall identity that is being communicated or image that is being received. And this is really important. Nike's an interesting example, and we'll talk through them a fair bit more. But if you were to think about, let's say, the National Hockey League, how important is it for the National Hockey League to manage and maintain the brand of the National Hockey League? I mean, that seems to be fairly essential. That seems fairly straightforward. That's something that they would do internally on Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue, wherever they are in New York. That's a big part of their organization. But they equally assist in helping the management of all 32 NHL member clubs. Those brands fit within the NHL subheading. They fit under the umbrella that is the NHL. And so when there's a scandal like the one currently ongoing with the Chicago Blackhawks, that impacts upon the National Hockey League. That is something that will always reflect back upon them. So how we understand the relationships that exist and the possibly power dynamics that exist between different elements of a brand really starts to impact upon how we are able to communicate those brands and understand the value or meaning or significance or cultural embeddedness of different elements of that brand and what they have to offer. From a management perspective then, this becomes a really important process, and this is something that brands are only really beginning to fully understand and fully ascribe the necessary value and meaning to But fundamentally, this is all about brand marketing and brand communications in a way that uses these brands to drive equity and to build or maintain brand associations in a way that creates and constructs meaning for the brand. What this can do and why this is so important for us from a marketing perspective and from a sport marketing perspective is that as we think about and realize and understand the different connections that exist between sub-elements or competing elements or contributory elements between an organization, the better we can start to create a narrative and an ethos or an identity or an image for the brand. And that will allow us to improve our offerings and to understand where there's opportunity, where there are challenges within the marketplace, and how we can utilize different elements of a brand to be able to communicate to different audiences. To give a sort of a brief and simple example, think about Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. At the core of the Maple Leafs brand is the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's in the name. That's pretty straightforward. That's pretty simple. But they have diversified that brand exponentially over the last 25, 30 years. So really in your lifetime, Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment has gone from owning the Toronto Maple Leafs and a hockey arena to owning the Toronto Raptors and being able to capture an entirely different audience through basketball. They became owners of Toronto FC and again were able to capture a new and different audience through Major League Soccer. They established ownership or took part ownership of the Toronto Argonauts, becoming a little bit more of a historical brand, taking on different elements and identities there. And with that, they have BMO Field, they have MasterCard Arena, they have the OVO Center. They have expanded their portfolio of different brands in order to befit and to embiggen the master brand, the core brand. Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment itself is a brand, and as they grow and as they develop, they start to add new elements which speak to different audiences, which provide new opportunities for connections, which build out the meaning and the overall significance of that brand. Over the course of 20 years, Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment have grown from being a hockey team to being the largest or second largest sport conglomerate in the world in terms of team ownership and in terms of identity and in terms of structure. This comes down to understanding what those different elements are all intended to accomplish and what they're trying to do. In a similar context, we could look at the NHL's new organization, the Seattle Kraken, and think about the way in which they're building their brand from the ground up. The architecture of the brand starts with something as simple as just a name, understanding who and what you are and what you want to represent. So by coming up with an identity and communicating that identity through some of the physical aspects, like the 3 different logos and the word mark that you see here, these are ways in which the brand is beginning to construct its identity. And I'm using construct here really specifically because this is essentially building. This is brand building. This is brand architecture. This is understanding that the Kraken as a name speaks to something about the city, speaks to something about the club, about the organization. And so the logos and the different elements that will come with that, the symbology of the Kraken are going to speak to that. So the S stands for Seattle, but is also a sea serpent. It's also a sea monster like a Kraken is. The anchor is going to tell us something very specific, again, about the nature of the organization, about the city, about being on the water, about this being a sea or marine-oriented organization. But that anchor also looks like a fish hook. That anchor is also bearing prongs. This is almost in some respects a harpoon and an anchor at the same time. So it's about taming or about conquering the beast as well as being the beast. If you take that the next step further, the Kraken actually, as part of their expansion draft announcements, released this squid into the Seattle harbor as part of their marketing. This is going to be their new mascot. This is part of the way in which they are trying to create and cultivate this image and trying to build out their architecture. So a mascot here is part of a brand, and when the mascot gets a name and begins to have its own identity, it will have its own brand that will become part of the way in which they market themselves, and they'll be able to sell merchandising that features the squid, and they'll be able to build out part of the identity. It will become a menacing part of their pre-game ceremonies. It will be part of who and what they are. take it one step further, and the arena that they're playing, Climate Pledge Arena, is part of their brand. The arena itself is its own brand and will take on its own meaning as it hosts more events and as it becomes part of what they are and brings in games and concerts and hopefully an NBA team and all the rest. But it also speaks to something about what the brand is. So whereas the logos speak to the marine theme and the mascot speaks to kind of a fun, monstrous theme, Climate Pledge Arena speaks to the more eco or environmentally friendly theme that the Kraken are trying to establish and create. All of these elements are being built, are being constructed by the Seattle organization and by the NHL to communicate different elements of what this brand is meant to look like. And this is a really important element of how we construct and elaborate and think about brand marketing and the communications that are being created and developed there, but equally about the relationships that are existing and that are being maintained and enhanced through marketing. Understanding the relationship that exists between, let's say, the arena and a marine-themed team is important. We could be talking about things like clean water. We could be talking about things like cleaner oceans. We could be talking about things like the health and well-being of marine life. This is part of the way in which the Seattle organization is going to establish and conduct and create meaning for their organization in the city of Seattle and the state of Washington, as well as outwardly for opponents and for new hockey fans trying to create this more monstrous or more kind of mystical or mythical identity through the idea of a Kraken. A really simple explanation, if you will, of the way in which we manage and create and really kind of architect a brand. As we get into bigger corporate brands, the management of brand architecture and the way in which we construct and structure a brand can be really quite complex and diversified. And there are a lot of different ways in which brands go about doing this based on the structure of that brand and based on the different elements that exist within that brand. So how we construct and create relationships and communicate through those relationships within a brand will depend a lot on the context of that brand. So how we think about what different elements of a brand mean or contribute to the brand's overall success. This can come from consistency between different offerings, so making sure that there is a consistent narrative or identity that is communicated through different offerings. It can come through diversity and understanding that different parts of a brand speak to different audiences or in different ways, and therefore we're able to diversify our offerings through the structure of the organization. But fundamentally, what this all is related back to and why this matters is understanding how the different elements of a brand fundamentally fit within the overall corporate structure of the central or parent brand and how they each benefit one another and ultimately benefit the core brand. Ultimately, these sub-brands are in many ways integral to the success of their own brands, but equally of the parent brand. And how we go about doing that is very much subjective, as I say. It comes down to the different ways in which we think about the brands. And if you go to the Aker and Joachim Thaler article, they break down 4 different forms of brand relationships or brand architecture. There's a spectrum that they relate to, which range from a branded house to a house of brands. And these are 4 very distinct and very interrelated forms that ultimately describe much of what we see in the industry, but equally only serve as a model for how we go about articulating and thinking about the different brands that exist. So first, we have what they refer to as the branded house, which essentially is a kind of corporate branded family, wherein the overarching name, so the central parent brand, is the fundamental identity of all the different elements of that brand. So if you would think about Google, for example, everything that Google does has Google or the G in front of it. In the same way that Apple, everything is an I. So Google has Gmail, it has Google Maps, it has Google Drive. All of these things are owned and housed and really formulated around the parent identity of Google. Apple is the same way. You have the iMac, you have the iPhone, you have the iPod, you have the Apple Watch. All of these ultimately are their own brands, but none of them exist without the parent brand Apple fundamentally providing the name, the identity, and much of the overall structure that we exist within that. In a sporting context, we see this a lot in European sport, where club system that exists in European sport means that teams own or clubs own teams in multiple sports. So for example, if you were to look up FC Barcelona right now, Barcelona itself is the football club, and we all think about the men's football club centrally, but they also own a women's football club. They also own volleyball on both the men's and women's sides. They also own an academy of multiple different sports. They even have ice hockey. FC Barcelona will be the brand and the colors and the image and the identity that exists for all of those. It will be the overarching brand that exists. And yet each of those teams, each of those elements of that club exist independently as well. In the same way that Gmail, in many ways, exists independently of Google Maps. And yet we cannot think about them as independent without understanding the way in which they relate. Now, a really simple and easy example of this in the sporting context would be Red Bull. So Red Bull itself is an energy drink, and as a brand, that is where they got their fame, that is where they made their fortune. But everything that Red Bull owns and invests in, they brand as Red Bull, or the closest thing that they're legally allowed to. So their F1 team is called Red Bull. Their second F1 team was Toro Rosso, Red Bull. Their hockey teams all go by Red Bull followed by the name. Same for their soccer teams, except for RB Leipzig, which still has RB in the name, which is essentially a random set of words in German, Rassenballenflüssen, to get around laws that would not allow them to be Red Bull. Everything is Red Bull for Red Bull. Flugtag, crashed ice, all of the different events and structures and properties that create, all fundamentally feed back into the parent brand. So this is a branded house that everything that Red Bull owns, even if they exist independently as their own brands, fundamentally is branded by Red Bull. The benefit of this type of branded house is that the values that are constructed and created from the brand perspective, that central parent brand, are then communicated through each of the different sub-entities and are expanded upon by those entities. So Red Bull itself is an energy drink. It gives you a chance to stay awake a little bit longer or have a little bit more energy. But by adding elements to that, like say a crashed ice, you get to see a physical representation of that added energy, of that type of action, that energy sport that comes with it. Through something like Red Bull Salzburg, the hockey team, you're able to see Red Bull add in new elements. So this is a way for them to bridge into team sports. It's a way for them to establish ownership or some sort of identity through winter sports. It's a way for them to expand the meaning of their brand. Fundamentally, branded houses are all about feeding value back into the parent brand and using the value of that parent brand to establish legitimacy in different offerings or to convey different information through those new offerings. Now, the second type that comes with this and related to this is what's referred to as the sub-brand portfolio, wherein the parent brand is essentially qualified by the sub-brands. So these different elements of the sub-brand are there to essentially enhance the parent offering or to complement it in some way. So if you were to look at, for example, FedEx. FedEx exists as a corporate name, and that's what's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But the different elements of FedEx, the sub-brands within, provide some sort of modifier or some sort of differentiation to allow us to augment offerings. If you were to look at it as essentially brand extensions from brand marketing, this is the way in which FedEx essentially articulates and identifies different elements of their brand, whether it's FedEx Express or FedEx Corporate or what have you. From a sporting context, this is something that we would see, for example, with Adidas. Many of Adidas's properties are Adidas linked, and the sub-brands themselves feed back into Adidas Group. So we have Adidas Originals, we have Adidas Pure, we have Adidas Equipment, we have elements like Adidas Skateboarding that are fundamentally part of the overall brand, but fit as sub-brands to try to communicate something within that. All of these are qualified by Adidas and by the Adi sort of prefix to bring back something of the identity there. This isn't to be confused with the third form of brand type, which is the endorsed brand. This is where the parent brand essentially serves as an endorser for smaller brands to lend some credibility. So for example, the PlayStation is the Sony PlayStation, and the Office Suite is the Microsoft Office Suite. What's happening here is Office and PlayStation are their own brands and their own identities, but they're being qualified by the parent brand, Sony and Microsoft in this case, as a way to lend credibility. So when the PlayStation first comes out and is competing with Nintendo and Sega, by adding Sony to the name, it's not just PlayStation. It's PlayStation, but owned and operated and created by one of the leading technology companies in the world. Office isn't competing with the Corel suite of word processing documents back in the 1990s and through to today. It is owned and created by Microsoft. It is founded upon and founded by one of the biggest corporations in all of technology and IT. This allows for the audience to understand the context of the brands and think about where the sub-brand is coming from and understand the value therein. By being able to see that value and understand that value, it's endorsed and it is justifiable, it is credible through the identity that's created. In a sporting context, we might see this in the case of some of the new networks that are forming in sport through different organizations essentially franchising their own organizations outwardly. So for example, the City Group, which is first and foremost Manchester City of the Premier League, have essentially tried to franchise out and endorse different brands around the world, taking ownership of different teams in New York City and Melbourne and Brazil and the Middle East and Africa, and creating different city football clubs. So Manchester City Football Club begins, and they create New York City Football Club and Melbourne City Football Club as ways to essentially endorse these teams. The partnership is being created to essentially build the City Group brand internationally by utilizing the similar ideas. We have a similar thing here in Canada. Atletico Ottawa joined the Canadian Premier League last year as essentially an endorsed brand from Atletico Madrid. Now, Ottawa does not have a substantial Spanish population. It doesn't have any great links to Atletico Madrid, but Madrid saw this as an opportunity to essentially expand their brand in North America and were looking to launch themselves into the Canadian marketplace, and did so by creating a brand and essentially endorsing it in North America. Now, for fans of the Canadian Premier League, having an association with Atletico is really quite substantial. There's a chance to bring in that identity and the experience of watching an Atletico Madrid game that will benefit Ottawa immensely in terms of trying to grow their fan base. And so too will partnerships with Atletico to bring in maybe younger players or developmental players in order to expand their squad. Outside of the actual sport franchising context, we also have things like Adidas and Stella McCartney. So Stella McCartney is a fashion designer, and she has her own line with Adidas of athletic wear and sporting goods, which is essentially endorsed by Adidas. All of the products are designed and created by Stella McCartney. They are produced by Stella, but they are endorsed by Adidas in a way to lend greater credibility to her line and to allow her the opportunity to expand what she does and who she is in a sporting context. This allows for a really fundamental and really important leveraging of identity and of value for the different teams and for the parent brand. And if you were to compare this to the sub-brand context, we're talking about much more independent entities in the case of a Melbourne City Football Club or Let's Go Ottawa or the Stella McCartney line, but one that still fundamentally feeds back into the ultimate value of the parent brands. So Melbourne City ultimately exists to help grow the Manchester City brand. Atletico Ottawa fundamentally exists to ultimately grow Atletico Madrid's brand. And Stella McCartney's line with Adidas is there to help grow Adidas and reach new audiences for Adidas and to try to convey something different about the Adidas product. So rather than being purely about performance wear and using the Adizero or Adipure line of fabrics, the Stella McCartney line is about reaching more of a lifestyle women's line, which previously Adidas has not succeeded in reaching. The last one of the brand types or the structures, the spectra that we see here is essentially the inverse of the branded house. And this was referred to by the authors as a house of brands, which is essentially when within a brand's architecture and within a brand's portfolio, there are a series of independent or individual brands that do not rely upon or grow with the parent brand. So these brands are ultimately each existing within their own identities, yet still housed and framed by a larger corporate umbrella. So for example, the Forzani Group, who you might not have heard of, are the organization that owns the likes of Canadian Tire, National Sports, Pro Hockey Life, Sport Check, Sporting Life, all these different brands that fit within one parent heading. This isn't Forzani's Canadian Tire, this isn't Forzani's Sport Check, or it isn't even Canadian Tire presents to you Sport Check. It's a way for all these different organizations to fit different elements in different areas of the marketplace. And if you were, for example, to compare the fact that Sport Check, National Sports, and Canadian Tire all sell hockey equipment, think about the different market segments that are addressed by those different organizations. So is Sport Check or even Pro Hockey Life, if we were to extend this to the fourth one, selling a higher caliber or higher quality of hockey gear, reaching a different audience in terms of hockey sales market than does, say, Canadian Tire? Now, Nike's a really interesting example of this because Nike actually owns dozens of sub-brands, and yet many exist independent of the Nike name. So while Nike Golf is essentially an endorsed golf line, where the golf line itself is owned and housed within Nike, Hurley, for example, their skateboarding line, exists independently, and oddly enough, in competition with Nike skateboarding. Nike itself has owned Converse and Umbro, and are part owners of both of those brands still. And yet they're not Nike's Converse. You don't buy Nike Chuck Taylors anymore. These are still owned as independent organizations and operate as independent organizations that ultimately help Nike reach different audiences. So Nike's lifestyle shoe line is very different to the Converse line, and they're not trying to cannibalize that, but rather understanding and realizing that by allowing Converse to be its own brand, or allowing Umbro to reach soccer audiences in its own way, we can create something different. So too with something like Cole Haan, which Nike recently acquired. Who would ever imagine Nike owning menswear and dress shoe line? That's not something that we want a Nike swoosh blazoned all over, but it does mean that the brand, the parent brand Nike, is able to have and establish ownership within that marketplace in a way that allows them to grow and develop and utilize maybe their product insights and utilize their technologies to help grow these products, but in a way that fits within a specific market. The Air Jordan line is their newest sub-brand, in the sense that up until fairly recently, the Air Jordan line was just a part of the overarching Nike family and was essentially endorsed by Nike. But now, as its own brand, they've been able to establish ownership in their own identity, taking on much more of Nike's more street appeal and more urban context, and bringing with it a very unique identity that helps Nike's identity grow. Perhaps the last example and the best example that we can provide here is all the major leagues. So if we were to think about the National Hockey League, they are the parent brand for all of the different teams that exist in the league. And yet it's not the National Hockey League's Montreal Canadiens. It's not the National Hockey League's Toronto Maple Leafs. It's the Canadiens and the Leafs as their own brands. And in many respects, you could probably argue for, especially the more established of these organizations, the teams actually have the more successful and stronger brand identities than does the NHL. And yet the NHL owns and operates as an umbrella over these organizations and provides many of the parameters in which they are able to do much of their marketing. There is still that essentially parent relationship, that house of brands that they operate and own, and that ultimately feed back into the identity of the NHL. And if you were to remove these teams or move these teams around or change their identities, that ultimately impacts upon the identity of the NHL and is one of the strongest and best identifiers of where value comes from for the league. Go back through all those different examples and think about all the different brands that we just looked at and the examples that I've just shown you. The reality is that very few brands, especially the brands that we're going to be talking about in terms of sporting leagues, organizations, or athletes, or sporting goods properties, things like that, actually fit within one specific format perfectly. So Nike Golf stands as a real outlier in Nike's house of brands, and so too would something like, let's say, Nike Skateboarding. These are examples rather of more of a hybridized form of brand architecture that we typically see. And the reality is that there isn't necessarily a right or wrong way to create and articulate these brands, and there isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule as to how we would do so. What's most important and what you really need to take away from this as you think about it is what relationships matter and how do those relationships explain or articulate or drive value or growth for the brands in some way, shape, or form. So if we were to go back to Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment, and some of you may end up working for one of the organizations within Maple Leaf's brand, let's think about what the relationships exist and mean for the Maple Leafs versus the Raptors versus TFC versus the Argos. Are they competing for the same markets? Are they competing for the same identities? Are they looking to grow specific elements in different ways or utilize different images or identities in a certain way? Does the Maple Leafs relationship to MLSE matter more than, let's say, the Argonauts? Is it better for the Argonauts to establish their own identity and think about where their value comes from independently as an organization that has historically been independently owned or that has not had that same leveraging of the Maple Leafs brand? Versus, let's say, growing and developing the Toronto Raptors over time. Let's say Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment finally and eventually do buy and create a WNBA team. How important will their relationship be to other elements of that organization? Would they want to be aligned closely with the Raptors in the way, let's say, the LA Sparks are to the LA Lakers in terms of their colors, in terms of their identities, in terms of their logos? Or would you be looking for something much more unique or different? When Toronto FC was created, it stood out that rather than being white and blue, they went for red. What does that mean in terms of trying to create a brand and think about where that brand fits and what they're trying to accomplish? How you construct and think about brands matters less in terms of the forms or structures that they fit in and more about the relationships that exist and where value comes from, and thinking about the benefits that will come from different elements of those communications, the associations that we're creating, that we're leveraging. Why this matters for you and why this matters for us is that as we think about and understand a brand, the identities that we're trying to create and communicate outwardly, or the images that our consumers are receiving and perceiving of us, allow for much greater clarity and simplicity and complexity, in a bizarre sense, of the messages that we are utilizing and that we are trying to share. And where we are able to create and communicate relationships between brands, that helps us build the relationships that we have with our audiences by embedding within those relationships new meaning and by allowing that meaning to be articulated in ways that is relevant to different audiences in different ways. The challenge that we're all faced with in marketing and that every organization is faced with is understanding how these different sub-elements or sub-brands interrelate and how they communicate with one another and how they ultimately help build out different elements of value within that. So what does it say that Hurley and Nike Skateboarding are competing with one another, or that Nike Soccer and Umbro compete with one another? Are they truly competing in an internal perspective, the way that Nike sees it, or are they merely competing in the way that we see it outwardly as consumers? What does it mean in terms of trying to grow out extensions and trying to understand where gaps can be filled and by which elements of an organization or a brand? Ultimately, what this comes down to is thinking about how consumers perceive of and experience our brands and how we can best communicate with them and to them in a way that creates some form of value, that allows for clarity, and that enables us to communicate with the complexity that brands require, but the simplicity that consumers need to process and to elaborate upon that understanding. At the end of the day, brands are socially constructed, and Jeff Bezos, the owner and founder of Amazon, refers to brands as being what people say about you when you're not in the room. And what he means by this, and what we mean, or what we need to understand from this, is that essentially brands are subjective. They are experienced outwardly by our consumer basis. And when we think about what a brand looks like and how a brand is able to be constructed and thought about, how we construct and create brand associations, how we communicate through the ABCs of psychology, and how we think about the relationships that exist within a brand, not just the relationships that exist outside of that brand, but within a brand, allows us to maintain and to create really quite important strategic messaging and to establish brand associations that convey meaning and value both to the audience and to us as a brand. From a critical perspective, whether we're thinking about the marketing side or whether we're thinking about just you as consumers, try to think about always and try to understand what brands are trying to say to us in all facets of their marketing and their communications. From an organizational perspective, try to think about what information is being conveyed by everything that we do, by the relationships that we create, by the sub-brands that we establish, by the ways in which we communicate value within those. Something as simple as the Kraken's logo tells us an immense amount about who that organization is and what they want to do. But that does not exist independently, and rather actually contributes to or complements all the different elements of the different brands that exist and the parent brand as we try to articulate who and what they are. For brand marketers, for sport marketers, always thinking critically and creatively about these, always asking these questions and thinking about where information comes from and how it's created and what it says is imperative. And the more you do that and the better you do that, the more you'll be. If you have any questions about all of this, send me an email, find me during office hours next week. If you have any questions at all about Part 2 of your capstone project, please do not hesitate to ask. I'm happy to help however I can. Otherwise, I hope everything goes great for your midterm exams and you're ready to go with those, and I look forward to seeing you all back in person again next week. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.